sweat and wine clung to the cobbles, where taverns bled noise into the streets, where brothels stood with doors half open, lanterns swaying in the foul air. The hour was late, yet the streets breathed with restless hunger. Men staggered from taverns with garlands slipping from their brows, the laughter of prostitutes drifting behind them like the rustle of silk. Slaves hurried with jugs of cheap wine. Somewhere a flute piped, shrill and broken, drowned by the cries of dice players. And above it all, aloof and luminous, loomed the Palatine Hill, the imperial palace. Its marble colonnades gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a citadel of majesty watching over a city sunk in sin. It was whispered so often it became truth to many, that a figure moved between these two worlds. That from the silk-draped halls of the Palatine, where marble gleamed and fountains sang, descended the wife of the emperor himself. She cast off her jewels, wrapped herself in disguise, and walked the same streets as harlots, selling herself for coins she did not need, competing with the very prostitutes whose livelihood she threatened. Her name was Valeria Messalina, Augusta of Rome, wife of Emperor Claudius, mother of his children, mistress of the empire. To call her a paradox is insufficient. She was the empress who dined beside senators and generals, who presided over ceremonies in the forum, whose statues stood in gilded temples, and at the same time, if we believe Rome's gossips, she was also the scarlet phantom of the Subura, revelling in lust without end. But was it truth? Or was it slander, sharpened by enemies into a legend darker than reality? The ancient writers did not hesitate. Suetonius, Juvenal, Tacitus, they delighted in her damnation. They wrote of her appetites as monstrous, her lusts as endless, her shamelessness as a stain upon Rome. To them Messalina was not a woman but a warning, the whore empress, the living symbol of decadence. And yet, the truth is slippery. Historians today argue that much of her legend may have been born not from deeds but from whispers, crafted to humiliate her husband, Emperor Claudius, the scholar mocked as weak and cuckolded. To slander Messalina was to mock the emperor himself, to paint Rome as ruled by a fool and his depraved wife. So who was she? Tonight, the camera lingers on the brothel door. Oil lamps sputter. A woman slips inside, her hood drawn low, her jewels left behind. The patrons roar with laughter, unaware of her identity. The rumour says she will not leave until dawn, until she has proven herself the last woman standing in a contest of lust, her appetite insatiable. But whether she truly walked here, or whether this story is the invention of enemies, matters less than the shadow it cast. For history remembers Messalina not for her politics, not for her children, not even for her fall, but for this, the empress who became the whore of Rome. And thus the stage is set. The marble of the Palatine, the filth of the Subura, the clash of rumour and power. Into this world steps Valeria Messalina, child of the Claudian dynasty, pawn of ambition, wife of an emperor, lover, betrayer, victim, legend. Her life will burn quickly. She will not live past 23, yet in those years she will become one of the most infamous women Rome ever produced. Her story is both tragedy and myth, her image both seductress and scapegoat. She is the Scarlet Empress, and Rome, that city of marble and mud, will never stop whispering her name. A world of contradictions, Rome in the 1st century AD was an empire of extremes. At its heart lay the grandeur of the Palatine, where emperors cloaked themselves in divinity. But beneath, in the twisting streets of the Subura, life was cheap, pleasure was currency, and bodies were commodities. The Romans themselves revelled in this duality. They preached virtue, yet their poets sang of adultery. They celebrated the sanctity of marriage, yet their leaders flaunted mistresses and concubines. In such a world, rumour was more potent than fact, and scandal was as intoxicating as wine. Messalina's story, then, is not merely the tale of one woman. It is the mirror in which Rome saw itself, its hypocrisy, its hunger, its cruelty. For if Rome was virtue, she was vice. If Rome was power, she was corruption. If Rome was majesty, she was decadence. That was the legend, at least, the child who would become empress. But before scandal, before whispers of brothels and lovers, there was a girl. Born into the powerful Claudian dynasty, Messalina's blood was blue with Rome's oldest lineage. She was kin to emperors, niece to Caligula, distant relative of Augustus himself. From her first breath, her life was not her own. She was a pawn in Rome's eternal game of power. Her beauty was remarked upon even in youth. Dark-eyed, graceful, she carried the promise of allure before she was grown, and in Rome, beauty was both weapon and curse. It made her valuable for alliances, dangerous for rivals, irresistible for slander. Her fate was sealed in marriage not to a dashing general or a young senator, but to Claudius, the awkward, stammering uncle of Caligula. At nearly 50, Claudius was twice her age, mocked for his limp and his stutter, dismissed as a harmless scholar. No one imagined he would ever rule. And yet, when Caligula was cut down in bloody assassination, Claudius was hauled from hiding and declared emperor. Overnight, Messalina became Augusta, Empress of Rome. She was not yet 16. Messalina's legend is born. The rumours did not begin immediately. At first she was celebrated as the mother of Claudius's children, as a young empress bringing vitality to an aging husband. But Rome is never kind, and soon the whispers began. She was beautiful, yes, but too beautiful. Charming, but too charming. Fertile, but too fertile. Everything in excess is suspect in Rome, and soon excess became her brand. The historians sharpened their quills. They painted her as insatiable, bedding nobles, actors, gladiators. They told of her prowling the streets by night, her face hidden beneath a hood, slipping into brothels where she sold herself for coins she did not need. They wrote of contests with prostitutes, her pride demanding that she outlast them all. Did these things truly happen? Or were they inventions of a senate that despised her, a clergy that damned her, a court that envied her? We will never know. But once written, legend becomes truth. Thus the stage was set for the contradictions of her life. Child bride yet empress, pawn yet queen, mother of heirs, yet accused of prostituting herself in the Subura. The camera fades from the rain-slicked streets of the Subura and rises over Rome in daylight, its 7 hills blazing with marble, temples smoking with sacrifice, and senators in white togas moving like ghosts beneath colonnades. In a city that claimed eternity, lineage was destiny, and a girl's life was shaped the moment she drew breath. Into this world of pedigree and ambition was born Valeria Messalina, her name already a weight heavier than her cradle. She belonged to the Claudian dynasty, one of the most ancient and proud families of Rome. Her veins carried the blood of conquerors and emperors, a river of ancestry that linked her to Augustus himself, though distantly, and to the notorious Caligula, who would later reign in madness. The Claudians were a house both revered and feared, their reputation a mixture of brilliance and infamy, their family tree as stained with blood as it was gilded with triumph. For a daughter born into such a lineage, life was no private matter. She was property of ambition, a pawn upon the eternal chessboard of Rome. Her childhood passed in villas filled with tutors, gardens where marble statues cast watchful eyes, and corridors echoing with whispered plots. While boys of her house were trained for war and politics, Messalina was taught a different art: how to charm, how to obey, how to be useful. She learned music, poetry, and the subtle diplomacy of the dining table. A Roman daughter was not raised for her own sake. She was trained to be offered to bind families, to cement alliances, to serve as the flesh and blood token of political exchange. Already in her girlhood, her beauty drew attention. Eyes lingered on her dark hair, her luminous skin, her figure ripening with the promise of allure. Relatives spoke of her as one who would marry well, perhaps to a senator, perhaps to a general. Yet behind such musings was calculation. In Rome, beauty was not simply admired, it was weaponized. A lovely daughter was a tool of ambition, her womb a vessel to bind dynasties together. For Messalina, that meant her fate was not her own before she was even grown. And yet, she was not without fire. Ancient gossip speaks of her as bold, willful, restless even in youth. A girl who understood too quickly the world into which she had been born. She laughed easily, moved with confidence, and learned the art of getting what she wanted with the tilt of her eyes. Whether these tales are truth or hindsight coloured by later infamy, they paint the picture of a girl whose spirit was already dangerous in a society where women were meant to be silent shadows. Rome in the 1st century was a place where scandal clung to women like perfume. The men of her family, uncles, cousins, grandfathers, schemed and killed for power, and their sins were often washed clean by triumph. But a woman, especially one as visible as Messalina, carried no such absolution. Every gesture, every smile, every whisper of impropriety could be sharpened into a weapon against her. It was not enough to be obedient, nor even virtuous. One had to be immaculate, beyond reproach, untouched by rumour. Anything less could be twisted into a story of corruption. Perhaps she sensed this even as a child. Perhaps she knew that her beauty and lineage made her as much a target as a treasure. Yet what choice did she have? To be born, Claudian was to be born upon a knife's edge. It was her family's ambition that sealed her fate. She was still barely a girl when her marriage was arranged to Tiberius Claudius Drusus, the limping, stammering uncle of the reigning Emperor Caligula. Claudius was twice her age, a scholar mocked for his awkwardness, dismissed as weak, considered so harmless that he had survived the purges of previous emperors simply because no one thought him worth killing. To most of Rome, he was a joke, an embarrassment to the dynasty. To Messalina's kin, he was an opportunity, for though few believed it possible, the blood of emperors flowed in him. And in Rome, blood was destiny, however unlikely. For Messalina, this union was not romance, it was strategy. At the age when most girls still played with dolls of wax, she was handed to a man nearing 50, his body marked by infirmities, his mind steeped in books and histories rather than the ardour of youth. The mismatch was obvious to all of Rome. Whispers spread immediately, sneers curling in the corners of noble mouths. A child bride for the stammering scholar, a beauty wasted on a cripple. Yet beneath the sneers lay envy. For though Claudius was scorned, he was still Claudian, still of the imperial bloodline, and Messalina had been bound to him like a chain of silk. When Caligula's reign descended into madness and blood, when daggers finally struck him down in the chaos of assassination, it was Claudius, whom the soldiers dragged from hiding and hailed as emperor. In that instant, the joke became ruler, the stammering scholar became master of the world, and Messalina, scarcely 15, became Augusta, Empress of Rome. What must she have thought, standing in the marble halls of the Palatine, the laurel crown upon her husband's trembling brow, the empire suddenly hers to walk through in jewels and silks? She was no longer merely pawn but queen, no longer the girl trained to be given away, but the woman seated beside Caesar himself. But in Rome, triumph is always shadowed by envy. As soon as she rose, enemies gathered. Noble women scorned her as a child of ambition, too young, too common in their eyes, too unworthy of the title Augusta. Senators muttered of her influence, fearful of the power a wife might wield over a husband so often dismissed as weak. And already, beneath the marble, the first whispers began, whispers that would one day grow into the thunderous legend of Rome's Scarlet Empress. Yet for the moment, she was simply Messalina, young, radiant, bound to a man old enough to be her father, and set upon a throne she had not sought yet could not refuse. It is here the tragedy begins, in the innocence of youth warped by dynasty, in the beauty of a girl weaponized by ambition. From these beginnings would grow the scandalous tales that haunted her name, of lust insatiable, of power corrupted, of a fall as swift as her rise. But in this moment, she was only a child of ambition, her future already carved by hands not her own, and Rome, ever hungry for spectacle, was waiting. The Claudian name was a burden as much as it was a crown. To bear it was to live beneath the gaze of Rome, a gaze that never forgave weakness, that magnified sins into legend. Messalina grew up surrounded by examples. Her uncle Caligula ruled with lunacy, transforming himself into a god, murdering kin in fits of paranoia, and drowning Rome in excess. Her distant ancestor, Tiberius, had ended his reign in the shadows of Capri, whispered to indulge in perversions so vile they could not be spoken aloud. Even Augustus, the revered founder of the dynasty, had seen his family racked by scandal and tragedy. The Claudians had given Rome emperors, yes, but they had also given it monsters. Messalina was a child watching the theatre of power unfold before her eyes. She would have seen the grim parades of prisoners through the forum, the executions staged as lessons, the senators trembling beneath imperial command. She would have heard the laughter of Caligula as he mocked his courtiers, the tears of noble women forced into his bed, the screams that echoed when yet another relative was put to death. She would have understood, long before most children, that survival in Rome required not innocence but cunning. Those who remembered her as a girl said she had a way of looking at people steady, unflinching, assessing. She listened more than she spoke. She knew when to flatter, when to remain silent, when to let her beauty do the speaking for her. Such skills were not taught in scrolls but in the whispers of slaves, the mutterings of relatives, the small humiliations and dangers that shaped a girl raised in a palace of knives. When her marriage to Claudius was arranged, she did not protest. No one expected her to. But even had she been free, what choice was there? To refuse was unthinkable. To accept meant survival, perhaps even triumph. And perhaps, somewhere within her, the embers of ambition stirred. Claudius may have been mocked, but he carried the bloodline. And in Rome, bloodline was prophecy. On the night she was wed, torches lit the streets. Musicians played, garlands were hung, guests feasted until dawn. Yet behind the celebration, there was mockery. Noblemen snickered at the mismatch the frail scholar and the blooming girl. Women whispered that her youth was wasted on him. But Messalina smiled through it all, her face unreadable. She had stepped onto the stage, and she would play her role without falter. When Caligula fell, butchered by the blades of his own guards, chaos engulfed the palace. Senators plotted to restore the republic. Soldiers searched for an emperor. Claudius was found trembling behind a curtain, dragged forth by the Praetorian Guard and hailed as Caesar. Messalina, scarcely beyond childhood, found herself Augusta, her head encircled with jewels, her body wrapped in imperial purple, her name forever bound to Rome's fate. No one could have predicted how swiftly her story would darken. But in that moment, with the empire at her feet and all of Rome forced to bow, Messalina was radiant, and the city that would one day damn her was already watching with hungry eyes. The marriage of Messalina and Claudius began as little more than an arrangement, a knot tied by ambition and blood. He was a man mocked by Rome, limping, stammering, often overlooked at banquets, more interested in scrolls than swords. She was scarcely a woman, her youth still wrapped around her like a fragile cloak, chosen not for love but for the politics of her lineage. Yet fate, indifferent to ridicule, placed them together at the heart of an empire. Rome had sneered when the match was announced. Senators smirked at Claudius, calling him a relic of the dynasty, a dusty scholar kept alive only because no one feared him. Noble women pitied Messalina, whispering of her wasted youth, her body bound to an aging uncle rather than to a hero of the legions. But marriage in Rome was rarely tender. It was a transaction, and this transaction bound Messalina to a man whose unlikeliness would prove his shield. For when Caligula's reign dissolved in blood, when daggers struck him down in the theatre of his own madness, it was Claudius whom the soldiers discovered hiding behind a curtain. The joke became emperor, trembling as the Praetorian Guard hailed him Caesar, and by his side, overnight, Messalina became Augusta Empress of Rome. She was no longer the pawn. She was the bride of Jupiter's chosen, seated on the throne of a world that stretched from Britannia to the deserts of Egypt. Her youth shocked Rome. Barely 15, she now walked the marble halls of the Palatine as mistress of compulrices, ceremonies, mother of the emperor's heirs, and the woman who stood between petitioners and power. The title Augusta was more than ornament. It placed her image on coins, her name in decrees, her figure in statues raised across the empire. Her body had become the symbol of continuity, of dynastic legitimacy, of imperial fertility. She bore Claudius a daughter, Octavia, and soon after, a son, Britannicus children who secured her position as mother of the next generation of Caesars. To the public eye, she was triumphant. Yet beneath the surface, the contradictions of her marriage gnawed at perception. Claudius, nearly 50, relied upon her youth as an adornment. His awkwardness, his limp, his hesitations in speech, these became sharper when contrasted with her vitality. Where she moved with grace, he stumbled. Where her laughter flowed like wine, his voice faltered in stammering commands. Together, they presented a tableau both regal and absurd, the brilliant child woman at the side of a man Rome still considered its fool. But Claudius was no fool. Behind the limp and the stammer lay a shrewd mind. He had studied the histories of Rome, memorized the intricacies of law, and knew well the treacheries of dynasty. He understood that power lay not only in armies but in appearances, and Messalina, with her youth and beauty, gave him the appearance of vigour, of continuity, of legitimacy. She was not simply his wife, she was his shield. Messalina, in turn, recognised opportunity. The palace was a nest of daggers, senators and freedmen whispering their schemes, generals dreaming of crowns. Claudius, though emperor, was vulnerable, reliant on advisers who flattered and manipulated him. But as Augusta, Messalina had a seat none could usurp. She learned swiftly how to speak when Claudius listened, how to flatter him without appearing to dominate, how to place her allies in positions of favour. In the great banquets of the Palatine, she sat beside him, her gaze sweeping the hall. Senators bowed, noblewomen curtsied, generals saluted. She watched, and she remembered. Every whisper, every glance, every hesitation, she collected them like a spider gathers threads. Those who honoured her received her smile. Those who scorned her found their petitions delayed, their ambitions thwarted. Even at 15, she understood what it meant to wield influence without seeming to grasp it. Yet already, the first shadows of scandal stirred. Some whispered that she was too bold for her age, that her laughter rang too freely with young men, that her beauty was too often displayed in silks cut daringly low. Rome, always quick to sexualize women it feared, began to murmur. To noble rivals, her youth and allure were not virtues but weapons they turned against her. She is dangerous, they hissed behind fans. She will ruin him. Claudius appeared blind, or perhaps tolerant. He doted on her, indulged her whims, defended her against sly remarks. He seemed to see in her not only wife but salvation, the woman who made him, the mocked scholar, appear as true emperor, and if she strayed in smiles or favours, he chose not to notice, or so the historians would later claim. The image of their marriage became one of paradox. To the Roman people, she was the radiant empress, mother of heirs, embodiment of fertility. To the senators, she was the dangerous beauty, too young, too ambitious, too charming. To Claudius, she was comfort, adornment, and perhaps the illusion of being beloved. And so Messalina's reign as Augusta began, woven of contradictions, child bride, yet queen, pawn yet player, beloved wife yet whispered seductress. The marble halls of the Palatine glowed with her presence, but the shadows of rumour were already lengthening. Rome had always loved spectacle, and in Messalina it had found a woman who could be transformed into myth. For now, she walked gilded halls with the crown of Augusta, but the city was already sharpening its knives, waiting for the day when her beauty, her ambition, or her indiscretions, real or imagined, would turn triumph into tragedy. The Roman people were not blind to the irony of their emperor's household. When Claudius appeared in public, shuffling in his sandals, his speech halting, his head bent like a scholar more comfortable with scrolls than swords, it was Messalina who stood radiant at his side, the embodiment of youth and allure. Crowds cheered for her beauty, yet their cheers often carried an edge of mockery for him. Some whispered that the empire itself was inverted, and the old man ruled in name, but it was the young empress who dazzled the eyes and stirred the whispers. At festivals, when Claudius presided over games in the circus, Messalina's presence eclipsed his. She leaned forward as gladiators fought, her eyes bright, her lips parted in excitement. Poets later claimed that warriors looked up at her before striking, eager for her approval. Was it truth, or the embellishment of enemies? In Rome, exaggeration always walked hand in hand with gossip. But the image was powerful, an emperor's wife whose beauty commanded more attention than his decrees. The Senate felt it keenly. For centuries, Roman men had governed by ancestry, by law, by the strict authority of their sex. Women were to be ornaments, mothers, pious attendants of the hearth. Yet Messalina, though she rarely spoke in council, wielded a presence none could ignore. A gesture from her could sway Claudius. A smile could elevate a petitioner. A frown could ruin a man's hopes. That power, subtle and unacknowledged, was more dangerous to the Senate than armies of barbarians, and so they began the work of undermining her, not with daggers, but with rumours. They whispered of her indulgence, of the feasts she hosted where laughter rang louder than sobriety. They whispered of her charm, of how young nobles bent eagerly to her ear. They whispered of Claudius's indulgence, that he was too blind, too grateful for her affection to see what others claimed was obvious. In these whispers, a portrait of the whore empress was already being sketched, though its strokes were not yet bold. But Messalina understood the theatre of empire. She adorned herself in jewels that caught the sun like fire, her gowns tailored to both provoke and awe. When she walked the marble corridors, she was not merely Claudius's wife, but the embodiment of Rome's grandeur, soft flesh cloaked in divine silk, youth beside age, allure beside authority. She played the role expected of her, but always with a touch of something more dangerous. Awareness. Awareness that beauty, in Rome, could command as much power as bloodlines. Claudius, whether oblivious or complicit, clung to her as though she were proof that he too could be admired. When senators mocked him, he held her hand more tightly. When rumours whispered of her charm, he defended her as virtuous. He needed her, not only as wife and mother of heirs, but as mirror, a reflection of vigour and legitimacy that shielded him from the scorn of a city still laughing at its emperor. Thus their marriage became a spectacle. To the people it was comedy, to the Senate it was threat, to Claudius it was salvation, and to Messalina it was opportunity. She had been given the role of Augusta, and she would play it with all the skill Rome demanded, even if the script was already poisoned with whispers of her eventual fall. Rome was a city that devoured beauty. To be admired was to be hunted, to be desired was to be endangered, and Messalina, scarcely past girlhood, was more admired and desired than any woman in the empire. She had risen from pawn to empress, her face carved into marble, her name minted on coins, her children proclaimed heirs to the throne. Yet even as she stood gilded upon the Palatine, whispers began to follow her through the corridors like shadows. The chroniclers of her age would not spare her. They called her a woman of dazzling beauty, irresistible in presence, her charm flowing as freely as wine. Juvenal, Tacitus, Suetonius, each dipped their quills not in ink but in venom. They painted her as insatiable, her bed never empty, her appetite without end. They claimed she seduced senators in their togas, actors smeared in stage paint, gladiators still bloodied from the arena. In their words, she was not simply a woman but a furnace of lust, consuming men one after another, until all of Rome whispered her name with both awe and disgust. But how much of this was truth, and how much slander sharpened into myth? Claudius, mocked as limping, stammering, bookish, was easy prey for caricature. What better humiliation than to say his empress cuckolded him before the entire city? To tarnish Messalina was to tarnish Claudius, to reduce the emperor to a figure of ridicule. A scholar so naive he did not know his wife turned the palace into a brothel. The rumours may have been born from malice as much as fact. Still, the stories spread like fire. At banquets, when Messalina entered in silks that shimmered like water, the hall fell silent. Eyes followed her, not only Claudius's but every senator's, every general's, every slave's. Her laughter carried like music, her glance lingered too long, her hand brushed too easily. A gesture that might have been innocent became in the mouths of others a caress, a promise, a conquest. By the time the tale travelled from the Palatine to the Subura, she had seduced half the men in the room. Actors, too, fell into her legend. The stage in Rome was half revered, half despised. To consort with actors was scandal, to bed them unforgivable. Yet whispers told of Messalina luring men fresh from the theatre into her embrace, their painted faces smudged upon her pillows. Gladiators, those brutal idols of the arena, were said to be summoned to her chambers, their sweat and blood not yet washed when she welcomed them. In every whisper, her lust was painted as indiscriminate, her hunger more animal than human. The most infamous stories were yet to come, of course tales of brothels, of contests of endurance against prostitutes, of the Empress shedding her jewels to compete in the gutters of Rome. But even before those legends took form, the groundwork was laid. Messalina was already transformed in rumour from Augusta to courtesan, from queen to harlot. And what of Claudius? Was he truly blind, as the historians claim? Did he sit in his scroll-strewn chambers, oblivious while his wife defiled his marriage bed with half the city? Or was he aware, quietly tolerant, unwilling to confront the one woman who made him appear vigorous in the eyes of Rome? Perhaps he did not care, so long as she bore him heirs, so long as she played her role as Augusta, or perhaps the whispers exaggerated her every smile into an affair, her every absence into betrayal. History gives us shadows, not certainty, but perception is reality in Rome, and perception crowned her the most infamous woman of her age. In the markets, vendors muttered of her sins as they sold figs and olives. In the baths, women whispered her name with envy and disgust. In taverns, men boasted of imaginary nights with the Empress, tales that grew wilder with every cup of wine. Each story, no matter how absurd, was believed by someone, repeated by another, immortalized in gossip. And the Senate listened. Enemies who despised her influence sharpened these tales into weapons. If she could be painted as depraved, then Claudius could be painted as weak. If Claudius was weak, the dynasty itself trembled. In this way, slander was not merely entertainment. It was politics, a dagger in prose aimed at the emperor himself. For Messalina, survival demanded composure. She could not silence the whispers. To acknowledge them was to give them life. So she smiled. She appeared at ceremonies radiant, her children at her side, her hand upon Claudius's arm. She played the role of pious empress, sacrificing at temples, praising the gods, hosting banquets with dignity. To the eye, she was flawless. But behind the masks of courtiers, the whispers continued, louder with every year. In Rome, a woman's virtue was her most fragile possession. For Messalina, it was a possession she never truly owned. Her beauty, her youth, her charm, all were transformed into weapons against her. Whether she indulged or not, the city would believe she did. For Rome wanted spectacle, and in Messalina it had found the perfect stage. Thus the legend grew. Messalina, the Scarlet Empress, whose allure was irresistible, whose body was a battlefield of rumour, whose very name became a synonym for lust. And the city waited, breathless, for the scandal to grow darker still. Night in Rome was never truly silent. The day's clamour softened into something rougher, darker the barking of dogs, the shuffle of sandals over cobblestones, the faint pluck of strings from a tavern, and, always, the laughter, low and lewd, that leaked from behind the painted doors of brothels. Oil lamps sputtered outside, their weak flames swaying in the wind, guiding men to places where coin and lust were exchanged with equal casualness. The walls inside were plastered with frescoes of obscene delight, couples entwined, bodies bent into postures as varied as imagination, gods and mortals mingling in erotic parody. In narrow chambers, women sat on low couches, their eyes painted, their hands reaching out to beckon customers with practiced ease. This was not the marble of the Palatine. This was the underworld of Rome, its filth, its vice, its unashamed hunger. Yet it was here, according to Rome's most scandalous whispers, that the Empress herself descended. Valeria Messalina, Augusta of Rome, wife of Claudius, mother of Britannicus and Octavia, left behind her gilded halls and jewelled diadem to slip through the Subura's shadows and vanish into a brothel's door. The tale comes down to people us through Juvenal and Suetonius, sharpened by malice, embroidered with obscene detail. They wrote that Messalina took on a false name, that she dressed in a wig and common garments, that she stood among the prostitutes of the city and sold her body for a handful of coins she did not need. They claimed she competed with the women, boasting she would outlast them all, that she would never yield until the final man stumbled away sated. Juvenal describes her as remaining until dawn, her body exhausted yet insatiable, still demanding more, her appetite a monstrous parody of womanhood. Truth or invention? The very absurdity of it has kept the tale alive. Why would an empress, draped in pearls and power, stoop to the beds of common men for filthy coins? Was it possible she was truly driven by a lust so unquenchable that even the palace could not contain her? Or was this slander, designed to humiliate Claudius, to turn the ruler of the world into the most cuckolded man alive? Perhaps it was both a seed of truth swollen into grotesque myth. Perhaps Messalina had lovers. Perhaps she indulged in affairs with actors or gladiators. Rome would have seen such things as shameful enough. But to accuse her of descending into brothels was to go further, to strip her of dignity entirely, to erase the line between Augusta and whore. No accusation could wound an emperor more deeply. And yet the story stuck. Imagine it. The empress slipping from her chamber at night, the palace guards bribed or deceived, her silks exchanged for coarse linen. She moves through the torchlit streets, the shadows of taverns falling across her face, her perfume mingling with the stench of sweat and wine. At the brothel door, the keeper greets her without recognition, taking her coin, showing her to a cell no larger than a closet. Men file in, one after another, unaware that the woman they embrace is the most powerful woman in Rome. By dawn, her rivals say, she is still there, still competing, still demanding more, her beauty smeared, her crown forgotten. Whether imagined or real, the image is unforgettable. It says more about Rome than about Messalina. Rome was a city obsessed with boundaries between noble and slave, man and woman, virtue and vice. To imagine the Empress crossing those boundaries, placing herself in the lowest possible rank, was both thrilling and horrifying. It titillated the imagination and confirmed the suspicion that all power was corrupt, all majesty a mask. If even the Augusta could be a whore, then what was left sacred? The tale was told and retold in whispers, in taverns, in the baths. Men laughed, women scowled, slaves shook their heads. Each telling added new detail. A contest against the best courtesan in the city, a boast of 300 lovers in a single night, a prize for endurance that only Messalina could claim. It mattered little whether these details were possible. What mattered was the scandal, the shock, the thrill of imagining the Empress debased. And always, behind the laughter, was politics. For every rumour of Messalina's brothel, nights was a dagger aimed at Claudius. His enemies wanted Rome to see him not as emperor but as fool, blind to his wife's humiliations, mocked behind his back by the very men who shared her bed. The story of Messalina in the brothel was not only character assassination of her, it was political assassination of him. Yet Messalina herself remained untouched, at least outwardly. No one dared confront her openly. She continued to preside over ceremonies, to walk the Palatine's corridors draped in jewels, to bear children, and smile at her husband's side. Perhaps she knew the whispers, perhaps she laughed at them, perhaps she raged in private. History does not record her response. What we have are the whispers themselves, the echoes of Rome's cruel imagination. But imagination can be more enduring than truth. The story of Messalina in the brothel has outlived the empire that invented it. For centuries it has been retold in chronicles, in poetry, in paintings, in the fantasies of those who saw in her both horror and fascination. She has become the eternal figure of the whore Empress, the woman who left marble for mud, who turned a throne into a brothel, who competed with prostitutes until dawn. Whether true or slander, it has become her. And so, when we speak her name, we do not picture her in the Palatine's gilded halls, offering sacrifice at altars, holding her children in her arms. We picture her in a narrow lamplit cell, her crown discarded, her body spent, her appetite unquenched. That is the prison rumour built for her, a prison from which even death could not free her. The brothel itself, as described by Rome's satirists, was a place of relentless economy. There was no softness here, no luxury like in the Palatine's perfumed chambers. The couches were rough, the linens thin, the rooms narrow and airless. The air was heavy with oil, smoke and sweat, the cloying scent of perfumes meant to disguise filth. Men came and went without names, their coins clinking against the keeper's table, their lusts as common as bread. To place an empress in such a setting was to stage the ultimate inversion. She who dined on peacock and oysters was said to lie upon straw. She whose skin was bathed in milk and scented with myrrh was imagined coated in the sweat of strangers. She whose jewels could ransom a city was painted as opening her hand for a handful of copper coins. This was the scandal's true genius, not whether it happened, but how vividly it mocked the distance between marble and mud. Juvenal, writing decades later, sharpened the image into grotesque satire. He described her as stripping off her silks, donning a wig, and taking her place among the lowest of women. He conjured a scene of the Empress competing in endurance, refusing to leave her chamber until every rival courtesan had yielded. Her hunger greater than theirs, her pride bound not to nobility, but to victory and debasement. He claimed she lingered until the lamps were extinguished at dawn, only then dragging herself back to the Palatine, her body spent yet her appetite unsated. To Juvenal, it was not biography but morality play. Rome, he declared, was rotting because its empress was rotting. Messalina was the symbol of decadence, the harlot who embodied the city's decline. Whether he believed it or not mattered little. What mattered was the spectacle he offered his readers, a picture so scandalous it could not be forgotten, Suetonius too repeated the story with relish, though his words carried the sly smile of gossip rather than the heavy moralizing of satire. Tacitus, more restrained, reported Messalina's alleged crimes as political fact, her lusts interwoven with her conspiracies. Together, these voices ensured that the image of the Empress in the brothel would be carved into history, as enduring as any inscription in stone. And yet, there are silences in the record. None speak of how she might have escaped the notice of guards, of how her absence from the palace might have gone unremarked, of how such nightly escapades could continue unchecked. The logistics strain belief, but Rome did not care for plausibility. Rumour is not bound by reality. It thrives on exaggeration, on impossibility. The more outrageous the story, the more eagerly it was believed. What Rome wanted, what it always wanted, was scandalous theatre, and Messalina provided the perfect stage. She was young, beautiful, empress, and thus, the higher she stood, the greater the delight in imagining her fall. If she had been merely another courtesan, her lusts would have been forgettable. But to imagine the Augusta reduced to courtesan was to expose the fragility of empire itself. It told the people that power was a mask, that beneath the jewels lay corruption, that even the rulers of the world could be dragged into the gutters of the Subura. This is why the story endured. It was not about Messalina's flesh, but about Rome's imagination. It gave form to every fear of decadence, every suspicion of corruption, every thrill of forbidden desire. And once carved into rumour, it could never be erased. Claudius's silence on the matter has only sharpened the mystery. Did he truly not know? Could he not have heard the whispers that spread from tavern to senate? Was he so blinded by affection, or so consumed by his books, that he ignored them? Or was he too humiliated to act, trapped between love and shame? Some suggest he tolerated her indulgences so long as they did not threaten his reign. Others believe he was too timid, too reliant on her presence, to confront her. Still others argue that the entire scandal was a fabrication, a slander penned by enemies decades after her death. But silence breeds myth, and in that silence, Messalina became more legend than woman. We must also remember the cruelty of gender in Rome. A man's lust was vice, but forgivable. An emperor might take mistresses, a senator might keep slaves for pleasure, a general might indulge in debauchery, and history would shrug. But a woman, especially a woman of rank, carried the weight of chastity as a crown. One misstep, one whisper of infidelity, could destroy her utterly. For Messalina, every glance became evidence, every smile an accusation, every absence a scandal. She was judged not by what she did, but by what Rome imagined she might do. And Rome imagined her endlessly. Thus the brothel story grew until it eclipsed all else. She bore children who would shape the empire's future, yet that fact is overshadowed by tales of her nightly contests. She wielded influence in court politics, yet history remembers only her alleged lusts. She was Augusta, yet her crown has been forever replaced in memory by the lamplit chambers of a Subura brothel. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy. Not whether the stories were true, but that they became truth by repetition. The reality of her life has been buried beneath the legend of her lust. Even now, centuries later, her name is invoked not as mother, not as empress, but as archetype of depravity. Messalina has become less a person than a myth, the eternal whore of Rome. And in this myth, the brothels still flicker with torchlight, the frescoes still leer from plastered walls, the men still shuffle forward with coins in hand. And among them, history insists, waits Messalina, the Scarlet Empress, her crown discarded, her pride bound only to her endless appetite. It may not be true, but it is unforgettable. Rome was a city where bodies were as political as armies. A senator's voice could topple a law, a legion could topple an emperor, but a woman's body, in the whispered imagination of Rome, could topple both. Messalina was no longer merely a child bride or a scandal whispered of in brothels. In the eyes of her enemies, she had become something far more threatening, a schemer who used her beauty as a weapon, her bed as a throne. The chroniclers wrote of her not only as insatiable in desire but calculating in choice. They claimed she did not merely drift into the arms of actors or gladiators for pleasure, but also into those of senators, equestrians, and generals, men with influence, men whose allegiance might prove useful, men who could be bound not by law, but by lust. Her bedroom, they said, was no private chamber. but a council hall draped in silk, where alliances were forged in sweat rather than ink. It was a dangerous accusation, for Rome had long feared the figure of the manipulative woman. Livia, wife of Augustus, had been suspected of poisonings to secure her son Tiberius on the throne. Agrippina the elder had been accused of ambition that rivaled men's. Later, Agrippina, the younger Messalina's own rival to come, would be painted as a seductress who used her son Nero as puppet. In such a tradition, Messalina was easily cast, the empress whose weapons were not legions or decrees, but her beauty, her touch, her whispered promises. Tacitus, grim and austere, claimed she secured the downfall of rivals through her liaisons. A senator who spurned her advances might find himself accused of treason, his estates confiscated, his life ended by imperial order. Those who pleased her, however, rose swiftly, granted offices beyond their merit. She, Tacitus wrote, had the ear of Claudius, and Claudius had the power of life and death. Thus Messalina's bed became the axis of Rome's fortunes. But how much of this was truth, and how much political invention? It is certain that men rose and fell swiftly under Claudius, and that Messalina's name often surfaced in their stories. It is also certain that the Senate, long hostile to women who appeared to meddle in affairs of state, had every reason to exaggerate her influence, to paint her not merely as adulteress but as corrupter of politics itself. The image of the Empress scheming through seduction was as useful as it was scandalous. Still, even invention must be plausible to endure. Messalina was young, beautiful, vivacious, all qualities that might tempt men to her side. Claudius, older, mocked, and often distracted by scholarship, may have leaned heavily upon her presence, letting her shape his choices through the subtle arts of persuasion. In such a court, where power shifted with every whisper, where freedmen and wives alike could tilt the emperor's mind, it was not impossible that Messalina wielded real influence. Even if the salacious details were embroidered by hostile pens, the rumours of her affairs grew more elaborate. Some named noble lovers, senators of wealth, consuls of dignity, men whose families had ruled Rome for generations. Others named equestrians, knights of lesser status, who owed their advancement to her favour. More scandalous still were the whispers of liaisons with freedmen, men of no noble blood, whose rise was despised by the Senate but welcomed by Claudius. To couple with them was not only lust but insult, a deliberate flaunting of Rome's hierarchies. Yet the most dangerous stories were those that blended sex with conspiracy. Whispers claimed she promised lovers not merely pleasure but power, that in the haze of desire she encouraged them to dream of greater things, of offices, of commands, of crowns, that her bed was a place where ambition was stoked as much as passion, and whether true or not, such tales made her more than scandalous, they made her treasonous, for an empress accused of lust could be laughed at. But an empress accused of using lust to plot against her husband was deadly. Still, Claudius seemed blind, or perhaps willfully so. The emperor, mocked as cuckold by historians, continued to favour his wife, to dote upon her children, to elevate her kin. Perhaps he believed the rumours were exaggeration, invented by jealous senators. Perhaps he did not care, so long as she secured his dynasty with heirs. Or perhaps, as some suggest, he was a man so desperate for affection that he chose to look away from her indiscretions, preferring the comfort of illusion to the sting of truth. Messalina herself remains silent in history. We do not know what she thought, what she felt, whether she laughed at the rumours, whether she feared them, whether she deliberately played upon them to terrify her rivals. All that remains is the image constructed by her enemies, a woman weaving webs from her bedchamber, ensnaring Rome in her beauty. And yet, even in slander, there is admiration. The historians who condemned her could not help but marvel at her audacity. To move so boldly, to wield desire as a weapon, to defy the boundaries set for women, these were acts both damned and envied. She was the embodiment of Rome's fascination with power and sex entwined, a living myth of decadence. The city itself seemed to feed upon her legend. At feasts, men toasted her name with smirks. In taverns, tales of her conquests were traded like coins. In the Senate, her enemies seethed, even as they repeated the rumours that magnified her shadow. Each retelling grew more elaborate, until Messalina was less woman than monster, a figure of insatiable lust and cunning, a devourer of men and power alike. But beneath the legend, a truth lingers. Messalina, young, ambitious, and bound to a man twice her age, may have sought comfort, may have sought influence, may have sought escape. Whether her affairs were as numerous as claimed, whether her schemes were as calculated as feared, she lived in a world where perception was deadlier than fact. And perception had already crowned her, not merely unfaithful, but dangerous. Thus the games of power and pleasure were set. Messalina was no longer merely Augusta. She was the Scarlet Empress, a woman whose body was imagined as both throne and weapon, whose every gesture carried the weight of scandal, whose every whisper was suspected of treachery. Rome, ever hungry for spectacle, had found in her the perfect actress, and the play was only beginning. The senators who cursed her name in private could never quite ignore the magnetism she exerted in public. When Messalina entered the great banquets of the Palatine, torchlight glittering on her jewels, even her enemies found their words faltering. She moved with a confidence far older than her years, her beauty sharpened not into innocence but into command. Men bowed not only because she was Augusta, but because her gaze demanded it. In that look some imagined a promise, others a threat, and so the whispers multiplied. She seduces with her eyes, she binds with her touch, she destroys with her silence. The Senate grew uneasy, for their wives and daughters could never wield such effortless power. To them, Messalina became the spectre of female ambition unchecked. They sharpened the rumour of her lust into something far more sinister, ambition through desire. She was accused of manipulating elections, of securing governorships, of swaying Claudius not with arguments but with sighs. Rome is not ruled by law, muttered her detractors, but by the Empress's bed. Whether such charges were fair mattered little. In a society where men feared the loss of their dominance, to accuse a woman of wielding power through her body was enough to taint her forever, and Rome, more than any city, loved its tainted women. The tales became theatre. One chronicler insisted she had an affair with a praetor who secured office through her favour. Another claimed she lay with a general before his command of legions. A third whispered that even freedmen of the palace, those whom Claudius trusted most, had passed through her chambers. No evidence was needed, the stories themselves were enough. The more implausible they became, the more eagerly they were believed. For in Rome, plausibility was a dull commodity, outrage was gold, and Messalina's supposed excesses were mined into endless wealth of scandal. What was true? She was young, vibrant, and alive in a palace ruled by an older man whose affections may have grown weary, whose infirmities kept him from embodying the virility Rome expected of its rulers. Did she seek affection elsewhere? Perhaps. Did she use those relationships to place allies in positions of influence? Possibly. Did she, as her enemies claimed, deliberately ensnare men in webs of lust to destroy them? It is unlikely, but the perception that she might was enough to transform her into legend. Even Claudius's defenders could not escape the mockery. To support him was to endure sneers that he was cuckolded, a scholar humiliated by the very woman who shared his bed. To condemn her was to paint him weak, blind, pathetic. No emperor had ever been trapped so completely by the imagination of his own people. And Messalina, for all her silence in the record, must have felt this pressure. How could she not, walking through the forum with all eyes fixed upon her, some with admiration, more with contempt, when she offered sacrifices at the altars? Were the priests truly praying with her, or secretly damning her name? When she kissed her children before the people, were the crowds blessing them as heirs, or muttering that their blood was corrupted by her lusts? Rome was never a city that judged fairly. It judged loudly, and it judged her without mercy. The irony, of course, is that those who condemned her most bitterly were often those who indulged in the same sins without consequence. Senators who kept entire households of concubines, generals who raped their captives, noblemen who prowled the Subura at night, their own names whispered in taverns. Yet none of these men would be immortalized in scandal. Their lusts would be forgotten, their names remembered for offices and wars. But Messalina's body, whether guilty or not, was made into eternal evidence. This double standard was not accident but weapon, for in attacking her, Rome attacked Claudius. She became the vulnerable point of his reign, the chink in imperial armour. It did not matter whether she had lovers, whether she schemed only that enough people believed it. The rumour was the reality. And thus Messalina became the embodiment of Rome's deepest anxieties, that women could wield power outside the Senate, that pleasure could outweigh discipline, that the empire's foundations of law and authority could be corroded by whispers and kisses. She became the story Rome told itself about decline a woman's body as the crack in the marble of empire. In truth, she was still very young, barely past 20, mother to children, Augusta in name, her life unfolding in the gilded prison of the Palatine. Perhaps she laughed at the rumours. Perhaps she despaired. Perhaps she played upon them to keep her enemies guessing. We cannot know. History records not her voice, but the voices of men who loathed her. But in their hatred, they made her immortal. The games of power and pleasure they accused her of playing were not simply Messalina's. They were Rome's own games, projected upon her, magnified by her beauty, cemented by her title. Whether she wielded desire as a weapon or was merely accused of doing so, the outcome was the same. She became the Scarlet Empress, forever entwined in legend as the woman who corrupted politics with passion, who turned lust into treason, and the city, hungry for scandal, demanded more. The next act of her story would be shaped not only by whispers of seduction but by the sharpened hatred of those who despised her. For Rome's daggers are rarely of steel alone. Some are dipped in ink, in rumour, in the venom of envy, and these daggers were already poised at her throat. The Palatine glittered, but its marble walls hid a nest of serpents. To be Augusta was to walk each day through coils of envy and ambition, where every gesture was weighed, every smile recorded, every mistake sharpened into a blade. Messalina, young though she was, had already learned that survival required not only beauty and charm, but an instinct for danger surrounded her. She had risen with Claudius's sudden elevation, plucked from obscurity into the throne beside him. The senators, who for years had mocked her husband as a harmless scholar unfit for rule, now bowed to him with lips that trembled, masking their fury at being ruled by a man they considered their inferior. And if Claudius's rule stung them, Messalina's presence seared them like salt in the wound. For she was not only Augusta, but a girl scarcely 15 when crowned, her womb already proving fruitful, her beauty eclipsing the dignity of Rome's noblest women. To see her ascend was to be reminded of their own impotence. So the noble women hated her. They whispered of her common blood, mocking the branches of her family tree that were not sufficiently patrician. They sneered at her youth, her bold laughter, her daring gowns. At feasts, they compared her unfavourably to the stern, matronly ideals of Rome's past. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, who had called her sons her jewels. Octavia, the virtuous sister of Augustus. Besides such paragons, Messalina was cast as a parody, a woman whose jewels were literal, whose laughter was too loud, whose virtues were too easily questioned. And the senators sharpened their tongues as well. They resented her influence over Claudius, resented the way her family gained prominence, resented the stories true or false of her lovers, rising in rank by her favour. Rome's ruling class had always despised being ruled by an emperor. To be ruled by an emperor's wife was unendurable. They did not attack her openly. That was impossible. Claudius still adored her, still held her hand in public, still named her Augusta and mother of his heirs. To strike at her directly was to strike at him, and no senator yet dared so bold a move. But whispers were daggers all the same, and in the shadowy corridors of the Palatine, in the smoky chambers of aristocratic villas, those daggers were honed. Rumour became weapon. Each whisper of her infidelities was repeated, exaggerated, embroidered, until it became unassailable truth. A senator scorned by Claudius might murmur that Messalina had once approached him with indecent proposal. A rival noblewoman might claim she had seen the Empress lingering too long with a handsome actor. By the time these stories travelled through the city, they were gospel. She had seduced half the Senate. She had debased herself in brothels. She had conspired with freedmen to rule Rome through lust. It was a campaign of character assassination, deliberate and relentless. And Messalina could do little to stop it. Rome thrived on scandal. To deny was useless. It only fed the story. To protest too loudly was to appear guilty. So she played her role, smiling through ceremonies, presiding over games, bearing Claudius more children. But behind the jewels and silks, she must have felt the knives. The women of the court became her fiercest rivals. They competed not only for Claudius's ear, but for influence through their own husbands and sons. To them, Messalina was a dangerous precedent, a young empress whose beauty and charm gave her power where they had none. They watched her closely, cataloguing her gowns, her jewels, her every gesture, storing away ammunition for gossip. If her dress was too revealing, it was proof of wantonness. If too modest, proof of hypocrisy. If she laughed freely, it was boldness. If silent, it was guilt. She could not win. Yet perhaps the most dangerous enemies were not women at all, but men who sought to control Claudius through her downfall. His freedmen Pallas, Narcissus, Callistus wielded immense influence, shaping decrees, enriching themselves, and manipulating imperial policy. They saw Messalina as both rival and threat. If she swayed Claudius, their hold weakened. If they could destroy her, their power grew. So they too whispered, feeding Claudius doubts when they dared, spreading tales among the Senate when they did not. It is tempting to imagine Messalina as oblivious, a young woman distracted by pleasure, too blind to see the daggers aimed at her. But perhaps she saw more than we give her credit for. Perhaps she laughed because to show fear was to die. Perhaps she cultivated lovers not out of lust alone, but as allies in a court that sought her ruin. Perhaps the web of rumour that ensnared her was in part her own, spun as defence, even if it eventually strangled her. For in Rome, alliances were fleeting, and enemies eternal. She must have known that one misstep could end her, that the same court which bowed to her today would devour her tomorrow. And still she walked among them, radiant, smiling, draped in silk, as if the daggers did not glitter in every shadow. The city outside the palace fed upon the whispers of the court. Pamphlets circulated, anonymous verses, mocking the Empress as a harlot, recited in taverns for laughter. Caricatures scrawled on walls depicted her with senators, actors, gladiators, her name entwined with obscenities. The more the Senate whispered, the more the people mocked, until Messalina became less a woman than a character in a bawdy play, her dignity stripped away by the chorus of rumour. And Claudius? He seemed untouched, or pretended to be. The emperor still honoured her publicly, still embraced her in sight of all, still named their son Britannicus his heir. Perhaps he believed the whispers were exaggerations, perhaps he preferred not to know, or perhaps he loved her enough to forgive, desperate to hold on to the illusion that his empress was still the faithful Augusta. But illusions cannot endure forever. The enemies at court were patient. They sharpened their stories, waited for the moment when rumour could become accusation, when whisper could become proof. For they knew the day would come when Messalina's boldness, or her recklessness, or her enemy's cunning would offer them the chance to strike, and when that day came, Rome would not hesitate. For in the empire of marble and blood, no one hated more viciously than those who smiled at banquets, their daggers hidden in the folds of their togas. And Messalina, radiant though she was, walked daily through their midst. Every empire is held together by appearances, and in Rome, appearances mattered more than truth. Messalina's presence at Claudius's side was itself a spectacle, meant to assure the people that their emperor was virile, their dynasty secure, their gods pleased. Yet in the eyes of her enemies, this same spectacle was intolerable. The longer she smiled, the longer she bore airs, the longer she walked, the marble halls draped in purple, the greater the envy she inspired. The noble women of Rome became her fiercest critics. They could not forgive her youth, nor her beauty, nor her ability to command attention with so little effort. Many of them were older, hardened by years of careful manoeuvring, trapped in marriages arranged for duty rather than desire. They had borne children, endured neglect, seen their husbands take slaves as mistresses, yet gained little in return. And then there was Messalina scarcely grown, married to an emperor, mother of heirs adorned with jewels presiding over ceremonies. She embodied every triumph they had been denied. To destroy her became a kind of vengeance. They whispered poison into every ear that would listen. At feasts, their laughter dripped with disdain when Messalina entered. Their fans fluttered to hide smirks when she spoke. "She is no Augusta," they muttered in corners. "She is a girl playing queen, a harlot clothed in silk." Every time Claudius indulged her, every time she was seen to favour a petitioner, the noble women hissed of manipulation, of seduction, of corruption. They were relentless, for envy never tires. The men of the Senate were no less dangerous. To them, The idea that a woman might shape imperial policy was abhorrent, yet they believed it readily when it suited their hatred. Messalina became their scapegoat for every frustration with Claudius. When the emperor promoted a man they despised, they claimed it was Messalina's doing. When Claudius refused a petition, it was Messalina's malice. When he wavered in judgment, it was Messalina's distraction. They painted him as weak, pliant, ruled by his wife's desires, a caricature as humiliating as it was politically useful. But perhaps the sharpest enemies were Claudius's own freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus. These men, once slaves, now wielded power greater than senators, whispering constantly in Claudius's ear, drafting edicts, managing the vast machinery of empire. They were hated by the Senate, envied by nobles, feared by rivals, yet even they were wary of Messalina, for she, too, whispered into the emperor's ear, and her influence could rival theirs. If she favoured a man, he rose. If she frowned upon him, he fell. The freedmen understood the peril. If Messalina's hold on Claudius grew too great, their own would diminish. And so they played their own games, sowing seeds of doubt, feeding whispers to the Senate, cultivating allies among her rivals. They waited patiently for her to stumble, knowing that when she did, they would be ready to strike. Messalina, surrounded on all sides by smiling enemies, must have felt the net tightening. Even her smallest choices became ammunition against her. If she wore her gowns too fine, she was accused of vanity. If too plain, of hypocrisy. If she laughed too freely, of wantonness. If she remained silent, of plotting. Every gesture became evidence of sin. She could not move without confirming the prejudices of those who despised her. The Palatine itself became a theatre of surveillance. Servants carried tales, slaves repeated secrets, guards overheard whispers. Nothing was private. Even in her own chambers, Messalina must have known she was watched. Every sound, every movement, every absence noted. And beyond the palace, the Subura thrived on gossip, its taverns roaring with tales of the Empress's supposed nightly adventures. By the time the stories reached the Forum, they were sharpened into certainty. Still, she endured. She appeared at ceremonies with poise, carried herself with the dignity of Augusta, bore children that secured the dynasty. Perhaps she believed her position unassailable. Or perhaps she knew, in the cold clarity of night, that her enemies would never rest until she was destroyed. And yet, her youth may have blinded her to the depths of Roman cruelty. Messalina had grown up in a dynasty where betrayal was common, where daggers struck from shadows, where the Praetorian Guard could crown or kill at will. But to live it as Empress was another matter. She may have thought beauty and charm enough to disarm envy, that Claudius's devotion was shield, enough against intrigue. She underestimated the hatred that gathered in silence, waiting, always waiting. For Rome was patient. Its knives could wait years for the perfect moment to strike. And Messalina, glittering in her youth, made herself too tempting a target to resist. Thus the court around her coiled tighter. Noble women sharpened their whispers, senators honed their slander, freedmen waited like vultures for her fall. All smiled at banquets, all bowed at ceremonies, all murmured their praises. And all longed for the day her crown slipped, for the chance to watch her dragged from the Palatine in disgrace. Enemies at court are never obvious until the last moment. They hide their daggers in flattery, their contempt in obedience. Messalina, surrounded by them, may have thought herself secure, but she was already standing on a precipice. And when the ground gave way, those who had waited in silence would cheer her fall the loudest. The Emperor Claudius was a man history never quite forgave. His limp, his stammer, his head that shook when he grew excited, his tendency to lose himself in endless scrolls of antiquities. These were the details the Senate loved to mock. To them, he was not a Caesar, but a caricature, a pedant elevated by accident, a fool crowned in a moment of chaos. And what better way to emphasize his folly than to portray him as the most cuckolded man in history, deceived by a wife whose scandals were the talk of every alley and every banquet? Whether Claudius was truly ignorant or willfully blind remains one of Rome's great mysteries. Ancient writers agreed on one thing only. Messalina's alleged debaucheries were known to all except him. Juvenal sneered that Claudius knew nothing, that his wife debased herself in brothels and beds while he studied law and history, unaware. Suetonius mocked him as a man duped. humiliated before the empire. Tacitus, more solemn, wrote of a ruler manipulated by those closest to him, his wife foremost. Among them, the image that emerges is of a man bookish and distracted, deceived beneath his own roof, his dignity eroded nightly by his wife's treacheries. Rome laughed at this portrait, for there is no spectacle the city loved more than a fool in power, and Claudius, they said, was that fool. But was he truly? Claudius had survived a dynasty where survival was no small feat. His uncle Tiberius had reigned in paranoia, his nephew Caligula in madness, and both had eliminated rivals by the dozen. That Claudius lived through both regimes suggested not foolishness but cunning, the cunning of invisibility. He had learned to appear harmless, scholarly, unthreatening. In a family where brilliance meant death, he had worn mediocrity as armour. When Caligula was murdered, Claudius alone of the Julio Claudians was spared, discovered trembling behind a curtain, elevated to emperor not because he was respected, but because he was underestimated. Could such a man truly be blind? Or was his blindness deliberate, a mask that served him well? Perhaps he knew of Messalina's indiscretions, but chose to ignore them. An empress, after all, was judged not by chastity, but by fertility. She had given him Octavia and Britannicus, cementing his dynasty. If she sought pleasure elsewhere, was it not better to look away, to preserve the illusion of harmony, to protect the stability of rule? Better a humiliated emperor than a fractured household. Better rumours than civil war. Or perhaps Claudius, who had been mocked and rejected all his life, simply clung to the woman who made him appear virile. With Messalina at his side, young and radiant, he could stand before the Senate, not as the limping scholar, but as the emperor with a beautiful empress and heirs at his knee. If she strayed, he preferred not to know, for knowledge would strip him of that fragile dignity. Yet the Senate believed him a fool. They repeated the caricature of a husband oblivious to his wife's lusts, of an emperor duped in his own palace. Each new rumour about Messalina was sharpened into a weapon against him. When she was accused of seducing actors, he was mocked as too busy reading scrolls to notice. When she was said to haunt brothels, he was laughed at as the last man in Rome to hear of it. To laugh at Messalina was to laugh at Claudius, and Rome laughed loudly. The irony, of course, is that Claudius himself had no shortage of lovers. He had been married before, and not happily. His earlier wives had betrayed him, one even conspiring against him. He had known infidelity, had tasted betrayal long before Messalina. Was his tolerance then born of weariness? Did he see in her behaviour not betrayal but inevitability? If so, then perhaps he was less fool than fatalist, enduring her scandals as one endures the weather, unpleasant but beyond control. Still, the tension between perception and reality grew unbearable. The people believed him deceived, the Senate believed him weak. The freedmen who managed his reign feared Messalina's influence and whispered warnings he may have dismissed. Each day that passed, each new tale of her lovers, made him appear smaller, humiliated, emasculated before the empire he ruled. And Messalina herself, if the stories are believed, grew bolder. Secure in Claudius's indulgence, she flaunted her alleged affairs more recklessly. She did not fear discovery, for discovery never seemed to come. The emperor, it was said, continued to adore her, to trust her, to walk beside her with unshaken devotion. His ignorance, real or feigned, became the very soil in which her scandals flourished. But ignorance cannot last forever. Rome was a city where secrets did not remain secret, where whispers became shouts, where satire became history. Messalina's enemies watched closely, waiting for the moment when Claudius could no longer be shielded by silence. For every indulgence has its limit, every mask its crack, every emperor his reckoning, and when it came, it would be sudden and merciless. Rome was a city of whispers, but in time whispers grow teeth. For years, Messalina had been painted as insatiable, her lusts the favourite subject of satire and slander. Claudius had endured it, whether through ignorance or deliberate blindness. But one name would rise above the endless parade of supposed lovers, one man whose story would seal her fate. That man was Gaius Silius. Silius was everything Claudius was not: handsome, young, aristocratic, descended from consuls, a senator whose stature in Rome was gilded not only by ancestry but by physical allure. Tall, strong, eloquent, he embodied the Roman ideal, the kind of man poets celebrated and generals envied. Where Claudius limped, Silius strode. Where Claudius stammered, Silius spoke with ease. To the eyes of Rome he was the very image of a leader, and when whispers began of Messalina's entanglement with him, they did not sound like idle rumour. They sounded like inevitability. Ancient historians tell us she fell violently in love with Silius. Unlike the fleeting affairs with actors and gladiators ascribed to her, this was described as something more passion entwined with conspiracy. Tacitus, grim in his judgment, claimed that Messalina and Silius plotted openly, their union flaunted with reckless boldness. He wrote that Silius divorced his wife to make himself available to her, a scandal in itself, for divorce was rarely so public, rarely so swift. He claimed that Messalina, no longer content with secrecy, paraded her affection with shamelessness. The whispers grew darker still, that they did not merely indulge in desire but schemed for the throne, that Messalina promised him imperial power, that together they dreamed of Claudius cast aside, Britannicus displaced, Rome ruled by them. The most damning tale was that of their marriage. Tacitus tells us that, while Claudius was away at Ostia, Messalina and Silius staged a mock wedding ceremony. Priests were summoned, witnesses attended, vows exchanged. Whether this was ritual parody, drunken folly, or deliberate conspiracy, Rome never forgot it. The Augusta of Rome, still wife of the Emperor, had bound herself in marriage to another man. Even rumour alone would have been fatal. To claim the act was real was to brand her not only adulteress, but traitor. What drove her to such recklessness? Historians disagree. Some say her lust for Silius was so consuming that she abandoned reason, intoxicated by passion. Others argue it was ambition, that she saw in him the chance to replace Claudius, to rule Rome with a man younger, stronger, more worthy in appearance. Perhaps it was both passion and ambition entwined, the intoxicating dream of pleasure and power united. For Silius himself, the risk was unimaginable. He was no fool. He knew the penalty for treason, for seducing an emperor's wife was death. Tacitus suggests that Messalina compelled him, that he was caught in her web, too afraid to resist, too enthralled to escape. Suetonius, always more salacious, painted him as willing, ambitious, eager for the throne she offered. Juvenal, of course, made it grotesque, mocking him as enslaved to her monstrous appetite. Whatever the truth, the affair was no longer whisper but scandal shouted across Rome. The palace buzzed with rumour, the Senate murmured in fear, the freedmen advisers sharpened their daggers of influence. Narcissus, most ruthless of Claudius's counsellors, watched with growing alarm. He saw in Silius not merely a lover, but a rival, a man who could, with Messalina's help, replace Claudius altogether. The danger was real. Claudius's reign was not secure. He had been raised to power by the Praetorian Guard, not by the Senate's will. His legitimacy rested upon his dynasty and the loyalty of those around him. If Messalina and Silius gained support, if the Guard shifted allegiance, the empire could change hands overnight. Rome had seen such things. Before, emperors had risen and fallen on thinner pretexts, and still Claudius seemed unaware. Whether blinded by devotion, distracted by scholarship, or lulled by Messalina's mask of wifely affection, he did not act. He dined with her, spoke with her, held her hand, while the city whispered of her treachery. To Rome, he became the very image of humiliation. The emperor cuckolded, not in secret, but in spectacle. The marriage of Messalina and Silius, if it truly occurred, was the breaking point. Even those who had tolerated her excesses, who had laughed at her rumoured lovers, could not ignore this. It was no longer scandal of the bedchamber, but scandal of the state. A wife could betray her husband. An empress who married another man betrayed Rome itself. The drama is almost theatrical. The Empress of Rome, radiant in youth, binding herself in false matrimony to a man whose beauty and ambition mirrored her own. The emperor, absent, oblivious, mocked as scholar too blind to see his own downfall. The city, watching in fascination, whispering in taverns, laughing in baths, sharpening its verdict before the trial had even begun. Messalina had played with scandal for years. Now scandal played with her. Betrayal in Rome was never sudden. It gathered like a storm behind the horizon, muttering in whispers, flashing in brief glances, until at last the sky split open and lightning struck. For Messalina, the storm had been forming for years. Her alleged affairs, her enemies at court, the laughter of Rome at Claudius's expense, All of it had created a sky heavy with doom. The affair with Gaius Silius was not merely thunder. It was the lightning that tore through the veil, exposing her at last. It began, as always, with whispers. Messalina's enemies, the senators she had scorned, the noblewomen she had outshone, the freedmen who feared her influence now had proof, or what could be made into proof. The rumours of her marriage to Silius spread like wildfire. Priests were said to have officiated, witnesses to have watched. Whether the ritual was real or farce, the telling of it was enough to condemn her. For in Rome, appearances could kill more surely than daggers. The freedman Narcissus, shrewd and merciless, seized the moment. Of all Claudius's advisers, he had the keenest instinct for survival. He had long feared Messalina's power, long resented her sway over the emperor. Now he saw not only a chance to destroy her, but to secure his own dominance. He whispered to Claudius, softly at first, then with urgency, "Your wife has betrayed you, your dynasty, your throne. She has married another man. Even as you sit here, Emperor, she plots with Silius to seize Rome." Claudius, if the historians are to be believed, was stunned. The words seemed absurd, impossible. His Messalina, the mother of his children, the woman he had doted upon, the empress who had shared his every triumph, to imagine her married to another was not simply betrayal. It was unthinkable. Yet the evidence was too loud to ignore. The whispers had grown into a roar, and Claudius, so long mocked for his blindness, could no longer close his eyes. Fear spread through the palace. Courtiers who had once flattered Messalina now distanced themselves, lest they be tainted by her fall. Servants hurried silently, their eyes lowered, afraid to be caught in the net of suspicion. Senators who had once attended her banquets whispered oaths of loyalty to Claudius. The very air seemed charged with terror, as though everyone in Rome sensed that a reckoning was near. And still, Messalina lingered in her illusions. Did she believe Claudius too weak to act? Did she imagine her beauty would shield her, as it always had? Or did she, perhaps, not fully grasp the danger until it was too late? History offers no certain answer. Tacitus suggests she continued to flaunt her bond with Silius, reckless in passion or ambition. Suetonius delights in painting her as shameless to the last. Juvenal sneers that she could not resist, even when doom was at hand. Whatever the truth, her enemies acted before she could. Narcissus, fearing that Claudius's hesitation might allow her to regain his favour, moved swiftly. He assembled the emperor's guard, rallied allies in the Senate, and demanded that the betrayal be purged before the throne itself was lost. Claudius, wavering, allowed himself to be guided. The purge began. Silius was the first to fall. Dragged from the forum, he did not resist. Perhaps he knew resistance was futile. Perhaps he had already resigned himself to death. Tacitus records that he begged only for a swift end, that he did not plead innocence, that he accepted his fate with the stoicism of a man who had gambled and lost. His execution was immediate, his body left as warning to any who dreamed of sharing Messalina's fate. Others followed. Senators accused of complicity, equestrians suspected of knowing too much, freedmen tainted by association. The blood of Messalina's alleged circle stained the stones of Rome. Each name struck from the rolls was another stone laid upon her coffin, though she still lived, and she, realizing at last the depth of her peril, fled. She abandoned the Palatine, her silks trailing in the dust, and sought refuge in the gardens of Lucullus, those sprawling grounds of marble fountains and shaded groves that had once been the pride of Rome's richest conqueror. There, among the statues and colonnades, she waited, trembling, her future collapsing around her. It is said she begged for mercy, that she wrote letters to Claudius pleading for forgiveness. She reminded him of their children, of their years together, of her devotion to him. She prayed that his love, which had shielded her so long, might protect her even now. But the letters never swayed him. Narcissus had already closed the emperor's ears. Claudius, weak and uncertain, allowed himself to be guided by the ruthless freedman. The betrayal was complete. Messalina, once Augusta, Empress of Rome, mother of heirs, was now a fugitive in her own city, her crown turned to dust, her allies scattered, her enemies triumphant. The court that had smiled upon her feasts now sharpened its knives in satisfaction. The women who had envied her jewels now whispered of her disgrace with gleeful venom. The Senate, humiliated so long by her sway, watched with grim pleasure as her downfall unfolded. Rome had always loved spectacle, and what greater spectacle than the fall of a scarlet empress? Night fell over the gardens of Lucullus, the torches casting long shadows across the marble paths. Somewhere in the palace, Claudius still hesitated, torn between affection and shame, between love for the mother of his children and the humiliation of her betrayal. But in the shadows, his advisers had already decided. Messalina's fate was sealed, not by Claudius's will, but by the ruthless necessity of survival. Rome demanded blood, the empire demanded purification, and Narcissus, cold and calculating, was more than willing to provide it. The empress who had ruled through beauty and rumour now waited for the final blow. The betrayal had come, not only from enemies at court, not only from whispering senators and jealous noblewomen, but from within her own household, from the man who had once loved her, now too weak to save her, too easily guided by those who hated her most. And so, in the gardens of Lucullus, Messalina trembled as the footsteps approached. The emperor returned to Rome not as husband but as judge. The streets through which Claudius rode were heavy with rumour, the people watching with wide eyes, wondering whether the empress would emerge forgiven or condemned. For years they had laughed at him as cuckold, whispered of her nightly scandals, sneered at his blindness. Now, at last, the city waited to see whether the scholar emperor could shed his mask of ignorance and strike like Caesar. Claudius himself was torn. Messalina had been his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in the theatre of power. He had adored her, indulged her, defended her against whispers. Even now, with evidence piled against her, with the Senate baying for blood, with Silius already executed, he hesitated. Could he kill her? Could he condemn the woman who had shared his bed, who had given him heirs, whose face still adorned the statues of Rome? Narcissus pressed him mercilessly. The freedman had orchestrated the purge with ruthless precision. He knew hesitation was dangerous. Already senators whispered of Claudius's weakness. Already the Praetorian Guard muttered that an emperor who could not master his wife could not master an empire. To save himself, Claudius had to destroy her. To save the dynasty, he had to erase her from it. Narcissus poured these words into his ear like venom, yet Claudius faltered still. He dined, he drank, he asked again and again, what should be done with her? His advisers answered in unison, she must die. But the emperor, weary and bewildered, struggled to form the words himself. Tacitus tells us that he vacillated, that even as decrees were written, he spoke of pardons, of mercy, of reconciliation. In the depths of his heart, the scholar could not silence the husband. Meanwhile, Messalina waited in the gardens of Lucullus, her world shrinking by the hour. Once the grandest villa in Rome, the gardens now felt like a prison. The fountains mocked her with their laughter, the marble statues stared with pitiless eyes, the groves whispered like ghosts. She wrote frantic letters, begging Claudius to see her, to hear her, to remember their children. She sent her mother, Lepida, to plead on her behalf. Lepida, who had long quarrelled with her daughter, now wept at her side, urging her to face her fate with dignity. But no reply came, only silence. And silence, in Rome, was more terrifying than words. In the palace, Narcissus feared Claudius's hesitation might yet undo everything. If Messalina were allowed to see him, if she were permitted to plead her case, her beauty, her tears, her voice might sway him once more. The emperor had forgiven her so often before, he might forgive her again, and that, Narcissus knew, would be the ruin of them all. If Messalina returned to power, she would take vengeance on those who had betrayed her. His own life would be the first to end. So Narcissus acted. Without waiting for Claudius's final word, he summoned the executioner. Better to kill her quickly than risk her return. Better to strike while Claudius hesitated than watch him falter and undo the purge. In that moment, the freedman, not the emperor, held the fate of Rome's empress in his hands. Messalina, hearing the footsteps approach, understood at last that her end had come. The guards entered the gardens, their faces grim, their swords gleaming in torchlight. She begged, she wept, she tried to summon courage. Tacitus tells us she seized a dagger, tried to thrust it into her own breast, but her hands trembled, her resolve failed. The blade clattered from her fingers. She turned to her mother, to the slaves, to the guards, but no salvation came. At last, the executioner took her life. Some say he struck her down as she cowered. Others claim she guided the blade herself in a final, desperate act of dignity. However it was done, her blood mingled with the soil of Lucullus's gardens, and the Empress who had once ruled the empire through beauty and rumour lay still. In the palace, Claudius was at supper when the news arrived. Narcissus leaned in and whispered, "She is dead." The Emperor said nothing. He continued eating, his face blank, his hands steady. Some saw in this silence grief, others relief, others merely the exhaustion of a man too broken to react. But one thing was clear, the reckoning was complete. Messalina was gone. Rome exhaled. The city that had feasted on her scandals now feasted on her downfall. Senators congratulated themselves on her destruction. Noble women smirked behind jewelled fans. Pamphleteers composed satires mocking her last moments. The people, who had once whispered of her lusts in taverns, now whispered of her cowardice in death. But beneath the laughter lingered unease. For if the Augusta could fall so suddenly, so completely, what security did anyone truly have? If the Empress could be struck down by her own husband's freedmen, then what did imperial favour mean? Power in Rome had never seemed more fragile. Messalina was gone, but her shadow remained. Her name was erased from inscriptions, her statues torn down, her memory condemned by decree. Yet even as Rome tried to purge her, it could not forget. Her scandals, her lusts, her downfall, these became legend, repeated by historians, magnified by satirists, immortalized in rumour. Her enemies had destroyed her body, but in doing so, they had made her myth eternal. The imperial reckoning had been delivered. The Scarlet Empress was no more, but the legend of Messalina was only beginning. The reckoning was not a single moment, but a drawn-out agony. Messalina's enemies knew how to strangle hope before cutting the throat. Every hour of Claudius's hesitation was an hour of torment, a cruel suspension between pardon and death. In the palace, the corridors throbbed with whispers. Senators gathered in anxious clusters, asking one another what the emperor would do. The wives of noblemen sat rigid at banquets, eyes darting toward Claudius's face for some flicker of decision. Freedmen and slaves, the invisible blood of the palace, exchanged rumours in the kitchens and courtyards. One moment, it was said Claudius would forgive her. The next, that he had already signed her death warrant. Uncertainty was the poison Narcissus used best, and he poured it liberally into the veins of Rome. Claudius himself seemed paralysed. He asked again and again what should be done with her. His voice trembled between outrage and despair, between emperor and husband. Some historians say he asked the same question half a dozen times at a single meal, the freedmen and senators replying each time with the same words, "She must die." But still he could not speak the words himself. In the gardens of Lucullus, Messalina paced the colonnades like a caged beast. The fountains gurgled with indifferent laughter. The marble statues of gods and heroes stood motionless, their stone gazes fixed upon her despair. She sent messengers to Claudius, letters written in her own hand, her pleas etched with desperation. She reminded him of Britannicus, their son, the boy whose future as emperor depended on her survival. She reminded him of Octavia, their daughter, who would be left motherless. She reminded him of their years together, of her loyalty in all things but desire. Surely he would not destroy her for this. Surely the husband she knew would soften, but no answer came. Her messengers returned, empty-handed, their faces pale. Some did not return at all, intercepted by Narcissus, who made sure her words never reached the emperor. Her mother, Lepida, came to her side in those final hours. The two had quarrelled often in life, mother and daughter estranged by pride and ambition, but in that moment of despair, the feud dissolved. Lepida held her daughter's trembling hands, urging her to find courage. "Do not let them see your fear," she whispered. "Die as an empress, not a harlot." Messalina wept, clinging to her mother as though she were once again a child. In the Senate, there was no hesitation. They clamoured for her death, each man eager to prove his loyalty to Claudius by condemning the empress. For years they had endured her mockery, her sway over the emperor, her rumoured lovers placed in positions of power. Now they were free to strike, and they struck mercilessly. Decrees were drafted, accusations piled, her crimes enumerated in solemn tones. To them, this was not only vengeance, It was cleansing the removal of a stain from the dignity of Rome. The people of the city waited, their appetite for spectacle insatiable. In taverns, men shouted wagers. Would Claudius forgive her, or would her head roll by dawn? In the Subura, where her name had been whispered in brothels, men laughed crudely, saying she would soon join the women of the streets in death as she had in life. In the baths, women clucked their tongues, some with pity, more with glee. All Rome seemed to lean forward, eager for the finale of the play it had been watching for years. And then the decision was stolen from Claudius. Narcissus, seeing the emperor's hesitation, knew the danger. If Messalina were permitted to see him, if she were allowed even a moment in his presence, she might sway him with tears, with beauty, with the memory of shared years. Claudius's heart was soft. His will was weak. One embrace, one plea, one reminder of their children, and she might be pardoned. And then Narcissus, who had moved against her, would be ruined. So he took the matter into his own hands. He summoned the Praetorian Guard, ordered them to the gardens of Lucullus, and gave the command that history would remember as both ruthless and inevitable. End it. The guards marched through the night streets, their armour clinking, their torches flickering in the wind. To the people who glimpsed them, they were shadows of doom, executioners of the state's will. They entered the gardens, their heavy sandals crushing the gravel paths, their blades glinting in the torchlight. Messalina saw them and knew. The last of her hope drained away. She seized a dagger, some say it was given by her mother, others that it lay among her possessions. She raised it to her breast, determined to end her life by her own hand, to deny her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her struck down. But her courage failed. Her hands trembled, the blade wavered, and she could not thrust it home. Tears streaked her face, her breath came ragged. She turned to Lepida, begging for strength, but even her mother could not guide the blade. At last, the executioner stepped forward. He was a man accustomed to death, hardened by countless killings, but even he faltered at the sight of the Augusta, pale and broken, struggling to master herself. Tacitus writes that Lepida urged him on, crying out that delay was cruelty, that mercy lay in swiftness. And so he struck. The blow was quick, the blood warm upon the marble. Messalina, once Empress, once Augusta, once mistress of Rome's whispers, lay lifeless among the garden statues. Her youth, her beauty, her power extinguished in an instant, leaving only silence. In the palace, Claudius dined. When the news was brought to him, Messalina is dead, he gave no sign of grief. He asked for more wine, continued his meal, his face expressionless. Some say he was broken, too hollowed by betrayal to react. Others claim he was relieved, grateful to be free of her scandal. Still others whisper that he never truly understood what had been done, that Narcissus shielded him from the full truth. Whatever the case, his silence was more damning than words. Thus ended the reckoning. Messalina's fall was complete, not only in life but in memory. Her name was stricken from inscriptions, her statues toppled, her image condemned. Yet her scandal, her lusts, her downfall, those could not be erased. Rome, in its hunger for spectacle, had already immortalized her. And so the reckoning was not only imperial but eternal. For Messalina, though dead, would live on in every whisper, every rumour, every retelling of her shame. Her enemies had won their victory, but in making her legend, they ensured she would never be forgotten. Claudius lingered at the threshold of decision like a man lost between two roads. His counsellors pressed him, their words sharp as daggers. She has betrayed you. She must die. Yet his mind circled endlessly back to the pair. Same images. Messalina laughing beside him at feasts. Messalina cradling Britannicus in her arms. Messalina radiant in purple at triumphal ceremonies. Could all of that be undone by passion? Could a woman's reckless heart outweigh the years she had given him? Some said. Claudius wept in private, his voice breaking as he asked, "But what of the children?" For Britannicus was young still, an heir the emperor loved fiercely. To condemn Messalina was to wound his son, to brand the boy forever with his mother's disgrace. Yet Narcissus was merciless. Better the boy suffer now than lose the throne to Silius. Your dynasty depends on her death. And still, Claudius hesitated. At banquets, he raised cups with trembling hands, asking over and over, what should be done? Each time the same chorus answered, "She must die." It became almost ritual. the repetition of a sentence the emperor could not bring himself to pronounce. Rome mocked him for it, the cuckold emperor, too weak to condemn the wife who had betrayed him, too blind to wield the sword of justice. But Messalina did not know how much time she had left. In the gardens of Lucullus, she waited like a condemned prisoner without sentence. The air was heavy with the perfume of flowering trees, the water of the fountains sparkled mockingly in the sun, and the statues of conquerors loomed around her like judges carved in stone. She wandered the colonnades, her silks dragging in the dust, her face pale from sleepless nights. Every rustle of leaves made her start, every footfall of slaves set her trembling. She wrote letters feverishly, begging Claudius for mercy, promising repentance, invoking the gods, invoking their children, but none of her words reached him. Narcissus intercepted them, burned them, smiled coldly as her pleas turned to ash. He feared her beauty, her voice, her power over Claudius's heart. One meeting, one embrace, one tear shed in the emperor's presence could undo everything. And so he starved her of hope. Silence became her jailer. Lepida, her mother, came to her side. The two had long quarrelled, their relationship poisoned by pride. Yet now, in the shadow of death, mother and daughter clung to one another. Lepida's voice shook as she urged her to meet her fate with dignity. Do not beg, do not tremble, show them you are Claudian still. But Messalina, once so radiant in public, wept like a child, her body shivering with terror. She had been empress of the world, but in that garden she was only a young woman of 23, desperate to live. Meanwhile, the city itself grew restless. Rome's appetite for scandal had been whetted by years of rumour. Now, with her fall imminent, the people clamoured for blood. In the taverns they shouted wagers on her death. In the baths, women gossiped that her beauty would not save her this time. In the forum, satirists already composed mocking verses about her marriage to Silius. The execution had not yet come, but her reputation was already dead. Finally, Narcissus lost patience. Claudius had dined long enough, wavered long enough, humiliated himself long enough. The freedman summoned the Praetorian Guard and gave the order that history would never forget. Go to the gardens of Lucullus. End it. The guards marched with grim silence. Their torches lit the darkened streets. Their armour glinted red in the glow. Citizens who glimpsed them turned their faces away, whispering that the end had come at last. The sound of their sandals striking stone echoed like a funeral drum. Messalina saw them enter the gardens. Her body went cold. She knew instantly why they had come. The fountains gurgled louder. The shadows seemed deeper. The statues leaned closer as if to watch. She seized a dagger, her hands shaking, and pressed it to her breast. Perhaps she meant to die by her own hand, to claim the final dignity of suicide, the Roman death. But her courage faltered. The blade wavered, her grip loosened, and she could not strike. She turned to Lepida, desperate, pleading, but her mother only wept, urging her to end it quickly. The guards surrounded her. Their eyes were hard, their hands steady. To them, she was no longer Augusta, but a condemned woman. The executioner stepped forward, his sword gleaming in the torchlight. Tacitus writes that Lepida cried out, "This is no time for tears, do not delay. It is mercy to die swiftly." But Messalina could not act. Her strength, which had carried her through years of scandal, deserted her at the final hour. She collapsed, sobbing, the dagger slipping from her hand. The executioner raised his sword. For a heartbeat, time held still. The Empress kneeling among the flowers, the guards watching in silence, the fountains spilling water like tears. Then the blade fell. Her blood mingled with the earth, staining the gravel paths of the gardens. The statues stared down, silent witnesses to her fall. The night air swallowed her last breath. Valeria Messalina, Augusta of Rome, Scarlet Empress, was no more. Back in the palace, Claudius sat at supper. When Narcissus leaned close and whispered, "It is done," the emperor did not weep. He did not rage. He did not speak her name. He raised his cup, drank his wine, and continued his meal as if nothing had changed. Silence became his judgment. To some, it was the silence of grief too deep for words. To others, it was the silence of relief, the end of humiliation. But to all, it was chilling. Rome had its reckoning. The Senate congratulated itself. Noble women preened, Pamphleteers scribbled satires, yet even in victory, unease lingered. For if the Augusta herself could be erased overnight, who among them was safe? The reckoning had destroyed Messalina's body. But her legend, scandalous, shameful, unforgettable, had only just begun. The gardens of Lucullus lay cloaked in silence. Once, they had been the pride of a conqueror, fountains spilling into marble basins, groves, shaded by cypresses, pavilions open to the sky. Now they were her prison. Messalina, Augusta of Rome, the woman who had ruled the whispers of the empire, stood in the same place as countless captives before her, waiting for the executioner's step. The night air was heavy, scented with flowers that mocked her with their sweetness. Statues of gods loomed in the torchlight, their unblinking eyes fixed upon her as though bearing witness. Every rustle in the trees became a herald of death. Every moment of silence stretched unbearably. She was 23 years old, Empress of Rome, and already at the end. Her mother, Lepida, stood beside her, gripping her hand with a fierceness born of despair. They had quarrelled often in life, their relationship poisoned by pride and ambition, but now the bitterness was gone. In these final hours, they clung to one another as mother and daughter, no longer Augusta and matron, no longer rivals, only blood united in grief. Lepida whispered urgently, "Do not tremble. Show them you are Claudian. Let them see you die with dignity." But Messalina shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, her body racked with fear. All her life she had been bold, radiant, untouchable. She had walked through the Palatine draped in silks, had laughed in the faces of enemies, had been painted as insatiable, unashamed. Yet when death came, the mask fell away. She was not the Scarlet Empress of rumour. She was only a young woman, terrified, begging for time. The footsteps came at last. The guards entered the garden, their torches burning, their shadows long upon the marble. They moved with grim certainty, men accustomed to death, indifferent to the identity of their victim. To them, she was not Augusta, not mother of heirs, not the woman whose name had filled Rome with scandal. She was only another condemned. Messalina tried to summon courage. She seized a dagger, perhaps placed there for her, perhaps brought by her mother, Roman tradition demanded, that the noble condemned die by their own hand. It was the final dignity, the last defiance, the only way to prove one's Roman virtue. She lifted the blade, pressed it against her breast, but her hands trembled. She could not drive it in. Her body shook, her strength failed. She lowered the dagger, sobbing, ashamed of her own weakness. "Do it, child," Lepida urged, her voice breaking. "Do not give them the satisfaction. Show them you are Claudian still." But Messalina could not. Her courage, which had carried her through scandal, deserted her at the edge of death. The executioner stepped forward. He was a man hardened by countless deaths, but even he hesitated. To kill an empress was no ordinary duty. His sword glinted in the torchlight as he raised it. Messalina fell to her knees, the dagger slipping from her hands. The statue stared down, the fountains gurgled mockingly, the torches hissed in the night air. In that moment, Tacitus tells us, Lepida cried out, "Strike! It is mercy!" And so the blade fell. The blow was swift. Her body crumpled among the gravel paths, her blood staining the earth of the gardens. The torchlight flickered across her pale face, now forever still. The Augusta of Rome, who had once been painted as insatiable, untouchable, unassailable, lay lifeless at 23, a victim not only of ambition and passion, but of rumour sharpened into execution. In the palace Claudius dined. When Narcissus whispered, "It is done," the emperor did not speak her name. He lifted his cup, sipped his wine, and continued his meal. His silence was as terrible as the sword. To some it was grief too deep for words, to others it was relief. To most, it was cowardice. The emperor had not dared face his wife in her last moments. He had let his freedmen kill her in his stead. Rome reacted with cruel swiftness. Her statues were torn down, her name erased from inscriptions, her memory officially condemned. The Senate congratulated itself on purging. The empire of corruption. Noble women whispered with satisfaction that envy had been avenged. Pamphleteers scribbled satires of her cowardice at death. She had been mocked in life as insatiable. Now she was mocked in death as weak. But memory cannot be erased so easily. The image of her final moments, the Empress trembling in the gardens, dagger slipping from her hands, executioner's blade descending seared itself into Rome's imagination. Her enemies had destroyed her, but in their cruelty they had created a myth that would never die. And so her death was not the end, but the beginning of legend. She became the Scarlet Empress forever, not because of what she truly did, but because of what Rome chose to remember. A woman destroyed not only by desire, not only by conspiracy, but by the unrelenting cruelty of rumour. In the gardens of Lucullus, the fountains still flow, the statues still gaze, the paths still wind through the cypress trees. Somewhere beneath the soil, forgotten but not gone, lies the blood of Valeria Messalina, and in that earth, Rome buried both an empress and a myth it had created with its own venom. Her death was swift. Her memory would last for centuries. The morning after Messalina's death, the gardens of Lucullus were quiet again. The fountains still spilled their water, the birds still sang in the trees, the marble statues of conquerors and gods still stood serene. Only the gravel paths, darkened with the stain of her blood, bore witness to the night before. By dawn, even that would be raked away, washed clean, as though nothing had happened. Rome was efficient in its erasures. News of her death spread quickly. The people, who had feasted on rumour for years, now feasted on her fall. In the markets, vendors whispered of the Empress struck down, some with glee, others with unease. In taverns, men toasted her downfall, laughing crudely that she had at last paid the price for her appetites. Women in the baths muttered that no beauty, however dazzling, could protect a woman forever. Rome's appetite for scandal was endless, and in death, Messalina provided one final feast. The Senate moved swiftly, as though eager to trample her memory before it could rise again. Decrees were passed, condemning her name, striking it from inscriptions, erasing it from monuments. Her statues were toppled, her likeness shattered, her image dragged from temples. The woman who had once been Augusta was now declared a whore, a traitor, an enemy of Rome. In official memory, she ceased to exist, yet the erasure was never complete. For every statue destroyed, another image lingered in private villas. For every decree of condemnation, another whisper of scandal circulated in taverns. The Senate could blot her name from marble, but not from Rome's imagination. She lived on in rumour, in satire, in gossip, passed from mother to daughter, husband to friend. In some ways, the condemnation only ensured her immortality. Her allies fared no better. Those who had risen through her favour were dragged down with her, accused of complicity, stripped of offices, their estates confiscated. Some fled, others were executed. Still others slunk into obscurity, their names poisoned by association. To have dined with her was enough to arouse suspicion. To have smiled at her was enough to earn disgrace. Rome, ruthless in its purges, scoured the court clean of her influence. And Claudius? He seemed to bury her swiftly. In public, he made no mention of her, did not mourn, did not weep. When her name was spoken, he fell silent, as though it had already been erased from his mind. Whether this was grief too deep for words or denial too heavy to bear, no one could say. But one truth was clear. He did not linger long in solitude, for in Rome, an emperor without an empress was vulnerable. Messalina had been Augusta, mother of heirs, the feminine counterpart to imperial power. With her gone, the throne stood half empty. And so, within months, Claudius remarried. His choice was Agrippina the Younger, niece of the emperor himself, daughter of the beloved Germanicus, sister of the slain Caligula. If Messalina had been dangerous, Agrippina would prove far more so. Agrippina entered the palace with cold ambition, her eyes fixed not on Claudius but on the throne for her son, Nero. Unlike Messalina, whose legend was one of lust and scandal, Agrippina's would be one of iron control, poison, and dynastic manipulation. Where Messalina was remembered as reckless, Agrippina would be remembered as calculating. In marrying her, Claudius exchanged one peril for another, but Rome did not forget Messalina so quickly. Even as Agrippina's star rose, the memory of her predecessor lingered, whispered in corners. Satirists continued to mock her brothel nights, her supposed contests of lust, her reckless marriage to Silius. Women warned their daughters of her fate. Beauty and desire are fleeting shields. Men laughed crudely that no husband, not even an emperor, could master a woman's hunger. Messalina had become proverb, cautionary tale, archetype of corruption. The cleansing of Rome was, in truth, a cleansing of appearances. Her statues fell, her name was cursed, her memory damned, but the rot she was accused of symbolizing, the lust, the ambition, the corruption, did not vanish with her. It remained in the marble halls of the Palatine, in the Senate's chambers, in the ambition of every noble family. Rome destroyed Messalina, but only because it needed her destruction to reassure itself. She was not the disease, only its scapegoat. In the end, the empire had been preserved, the dynasty secured, the emperor's humiliation washed away in blood, but Rome itself was unchanged. The city still whispered, still schemed, still thirsted for spectacle. Messalina was gone, but her legend remained the Scarlet Empress, destroyed by her own passions or by the envy of a court that could not forgive her power. And as Claudius walked beside Agrippina, as new scandals brewed in the shadows, Rome asked itself the question it always asked: how long before the next empress fell? History is not truth. It is a chorus of voices, each with its own venom, its own bias, its own hunger. In the case of Messalina, those voices were almost entirely male, hostile, and eager to transform a young empress into a monster of lust. Her life ended in the gardens of Lucullus, but her legend was just beginning, and it was shaped less by who she was than by how Rome chose to remember her. Juvenal, the satirist, gave her the most grotesque immortality. He told of her nightly descent into brothels, of contests against prostitutes, of an appetite so insatiable that dawn itself could not exhaust her. To him, she was not merely unfaithful but unnatural, a woman turned beast, a parody of Rome's decline. His words were less history than theatre, a performance meant to scandalize and amuse. Yet it is Juvenal's Messalina, the whore empress, the prostitute queen that has echoed most loudly through the centuries. Tacitus, darker and more restrained, painted her as reckless in both desire and ambition. He emphasized her liaison with Gaius Silius, not as mere adultery but as treason. To him, she was a cautionary tale of unchecked passion, her downfall a necessary purification of Rome. Tacitus was not a gossip, he was a moralist. He sought to show how the empire rotted from within, and Messalina was a convenient symbol of that rot. Suetonius, ever the collector of scandal, could not resist her. His tales are gleeful, obscene, delivered with the sly smile of a man who knows he is delighting his audience. He wrote of her shameless appetites, her debauched games, her humiliations of Claudius. To him, she was entertainment, a bawdy anecdote dressed in imperial purple. Between these three voices, satirist, moralist, gossip, Messalina was buried. Nowhere do we hear her own words, her own defence, her own truth. Her letters to Claudius, begging for mercy, were destroyed by Narcissus. Her speeches, if she ever made them, were never recorded. Her friends, if she had any, remained silent, too afraid to defend her. She is remembered only through the pens of her enemies, and so the question lingers: who was she really? Was she truly the insatiable woman of Juvenal's satire, competing with prostitutes in endurance and lust? Or was that fantasy, born from Rome's obsession with sexualizing and demonizing women who stepped outside their prescribed roles? Was she truly the reckless traitor Tacitus described, binding herself to Silius in mock marriage, plotting to seize the empire? Or was that political invention, a convenient narrative to justify her execution and Claudius's weakness? Perhaps she was neither monster nor martyr. Perhaps she was simply young, beautiful, and trapped. Married at 15 to a man old enough to be her father, mocked for his limp and stammer, Claudius could never have been a partner of passion. Messalina, restless and radiant, may have sought affection elsewhere, as countless Roman men did without censure, but a woman's body was judged by harsher standards. Where a man's affairs were indulgence, a woman's were treason. Perhaps she did love Silius, recklessly, passionately, fatally. Perhaps she saw in him not only a lover but a partner, a man whose strength balanced Claudius's weakness, whose youth matched her own. Perhaps the so-called marriage was not conspiracy but delirium, the desperate act of a woman intoxicated by desire. Or perhaps the entire story was crafted after her death, shaped by men eager to excuse Claudius's humiliation. Better, after all, to paint her as monstrous than to admit the emperor had been manipulated by his freedmen, had allowed his wife to be executed without trial, had eaten supper while she bled in the gardens. By damning her, they cleansed him. By making her infamous, they made him blameless. The truth may be lost forever. But what endures is the legend. Messalina became the archetype of the whore empress, invoked by moralists for centuries as a warning against female ambition, against female sexuality, against women who refused to be silent. Painters in the Renaissance and Baroque eras depicted her in silks, slipping from her shoulders, surrounded by naked courtesans, her eyes glittering with lust. Playwrights and poets turned her into symbol of decadence, her name synonymous with corruption. Even today, her name survives as shorthand for wantonness, her identity reduced to rumour. And yet, there is something haunting in this reduction, for in damning her, Rome revealed itself. The cruelty of her legend is less about Messalina than about the society that invented her. Rome could not tolerate a woman who wielded power, whether through beauty, wit, or ambition. It could not forgive a young empress who seemed to shape her own destiny, and so it destroyed her, not only in body but in memory. She was not the first woman so treated, nor the last. Livia was accused of poisoning Augustus. Agrippina, the younger, would be accused of incest with her son Nero. Cleopatra had already been immortalized as seductress, not stateswoman. The pattern is as old as empire. When women grasp power, men answer with slander. And so we are left with a question whispered through the centuries. Was Messalina truly the monster of lust Rome claimed her to be, or was she merely its most convenient scapegoat? Her silence, imposed by death, has left the answer forever obscured. All we have are the venomous voices of those who hated her, the cruel laughter of those who toppled her statues, the lewd verses of those who reduced her to caricature. Yet in that silence, in that absence, there is a haunting presence. For if history made her myth, then perhaps her truest self still lingers unseen, unheard, waiting. And perhaps that is her greatest tragedy. Not that she died young, not that she was executed in a garden, but that her voice was stolen, her story rewritten, her identity devoured by rumour. Messalina was not only killed by Rome, she was erased. And yet, paradoxically, Rome cannot forget her. The whore empress still lives in its memory, in its art, in its whispers. Her legend, born of venom, has outlasted marble and empire alike. The brothel door creaks open once more. Oil lamps flicker, casting their dim glow upon painted walls where obscene frescoes leer. In the distance, the Palatine glitters, its marble halls gleaming in torchlight. Between these two worlds, the sordid chamber of vice and the gilded palace of emperors, Rome placed Valeria Messalina. And though centuries have passed, the whisper remains. Did the Augusta of Rome truly walk among prostitutes at night, competing with them for lovers? Or was it all a lie, the cruelest slander ever whispered in imperial history? Rome remembers her not as mother, nor wife, nor empress, but as myth. In taverns and forums, her name became a curse, a jest, a warning. In the writings of Juvenal, she was insatiable, monstrous in lust, reduced to caricature. In the solemn histories of Tacitus, she was reckless, treasonous, a danger to the state. In Suetonius, she was spectacle, the bawdy anecdote told with a wink. And in every retelling, she grew less human, more legend. Her statues were torn down, her name struck from inscriptions, her memory officially condemned, yet paradoxically, she became immortal. For Rome, in trying to erase her, ensured she would be remembered forever. To destroy someone utterly, one must silence their name, but Rome could not. It spoke her name endlessly, in satire, in gossip, in condemnation, and so Messalina lives still, not in marble but in whisper. What truth lies beneath the legend, we cannot know. Perhaps she was reckless, perhaps she loved too passionately, perhaps she defied the constraints of her role with a boldness that doomed her, or perhaps she was only a victim, a young woman caught in the jaws of politics, her every gesture twisted by enemies, her every smile transformed into evidence of sin. Perhaps she was neither whore nor saint, but simply human. Yet Rome never allowed her humanity. Her story reveals less about Messalina than about the empire that damned her. Rome could not forgive a woman who wielded power outside the Senate. It could not forgive a woman who embodied sexuality openly. It could not forgive a woman who overshadowed its men. And so it destroyed her, as it destroyed many women, with poison, with rumour, with silence. But Messalina's legend has endured because it touches on something deeper, the fascination with women who cross the lines of power and desire. Cleopatra, Jezebel, Lucrezia, Borgia, each remembered as temptress more than sovereign, each reduced to body rather than mind. Messalina stands among them, Rome's scarlet empress, her crown forever tangled with lust in memory. Yet there is irony here, for though her enemies tried to make her shame eternal, they also ensured her immortality. Agrippina the Younger, who followed her, wielded power with icy calculation, guiding Rome's destiny through her son Nero. Yet it is Messalina, not Agrippina, whose name still conjures fascination centuries later. She became the archetype, the caution, the myth. Rome itself could not escape her shadow. The empire would fall not to Messalina's scandal, but to centuries of its own corruption, its own hunger for spectacle, its own inability to distinguish truth from theatre. In this way, Messalina was not anomaly but reflection Rome itself, beautiful and corrupt, powerful and decayed, dazzling in its grandeur and rotten beneath the marble. The camera draws back from the gardens where she died, from the palace where Claudius ate in silence, from the brothels where rumour placed her body. We see Rome itself, eternal, its streets alive with laughter, malice, envy, lust, the same forces that shaped her legend. And in the shadows of those streets, her name still lingers. Valeria Messalina, Augusta of Rome, Scarlet Empress. Was she victim or villain? History cannot say. But in the mirrors of rumour, in the whispers of empire, her reflection still flickers, part woman, part myth, forever caught between lust and power, forever walking the line between brothel and throne. Rome remembers in whispers, and the whispers never die.